In 1950, the Chinese invaded Tibet. Thanks to the fact that the Chinese Empire had at one point owned Tibet, they claim sovereign right over it now, and no one at the time had the resources to stop them. Now, Tibet was no Shangri-La. The lamas and spiritual leaders ruled over Tibet just like any king. The people were poor and had little power. The Chinese invaded and did some good advancements to the area, and dismantled the rather corrupt government. The current Dalai Lama was only 15 at the time when he was given the title. After that, what China did started going really bad. The Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution were disastrous for all of China, its culture, its people, and Tibet was no exception. Throughout China, old ways and pieces of imperial past and relics were smashed and destroyed. The forced inability to worship as they chose, the co-opting of Tibetan literature for Chinese propaganda were all impacts of the Cultural Revolution. Now, mass displacement by Han Chinese and the theft of land is hurting Tibetan cultures even more. This is cultural genocide. In my video on white genocide, people claim that there was also a white cultural genocide going on in the West. This is very wrong and laughable for many reasons. A culture is viewed as a collection of mimetic ideas held by a certain population. These meme collections can vary from region, to town, to neighborhood, to even households. For every generation, these memes change. There is no white culture. If I went to Europe, much of their culture is so different from American culture. And Indiana culture is surprisingly different from Northern Virginia culture, which is different from Southern or West Virginia culture. Back in the day, a marriage between an Italian and an Irish person were considered mixed marriages that would just never work, even though they were from the same religion. Integration is very awkward to begin with, but minorities moving in at a small percentage of population, so long as they aren't isolated, absorb a lot of memes of the nation, especially the second or third generations. There are bad ways to do integration, which should be more focused on, than the actual immigration. There are issues of social capital that occur with immigration. People point out that in homogeneous societies, people are more trusting of each other. They often are more generous and happy, and likely to work together for the greater good. Consequently, they often have better social safety nets. Studies in trust and game theory show that white college students in America were much less likely to trust Asian students, and screwed them over way more often than the other way around. I don't know if this says something awful about white people. However, there was a downside to homogeneous populations, and that is a cultural stagnation of creativity and innovation. Studies show that places with a blend of cultures like big metropolises have a massive outpouring of innovation and creativity, as the meme of cultures basically have sex and produce great art, technology, inspiration, and muse. Scientific papers written by a group of people with the most diversity have the biggest impact on their field, as they can all see the problem from different angles. They can catch mistakes the others may be blind to, and their ideas play off of each other. Places with homogeneous populations, while they're much more trusting of each other, aren't as well known for their innovation and creativity. The impacts of cultural homogeneity and high social capital also show a high level of income equality, while social capital is damaged with higher income inequality, as people can pay to be more antisocial and isolated from others, which increases distrust of those poorer than you and gives you a lot more license to screw people over, as you're convinced they would do the same to you. Middle-class people use their wealth to also avoid interactions, and when they do, they tend to be less involved with local governments, causing a decline in power that the average person has locally. Areas that have the least interactions with immigrants are also the people most afraid of them. Forced interactions can over time increase social capital. Americans are freaking out about immigrants replacing white culture. The U.S. only hands out about 140,000 permanent work visas. This is a 0.04 rise in population from immigration. However, 4% of the U.S. is here illegally, roughly 70% of them being Mexican. Mind you, that number fluctuates based on the economy, and for the last half-decade, Mexicans have been leaving this country in higher numbers than they enter because this really isn't a land of opportunity at the moment. Of course, Mexicans are a mix of Spanish, white Europeans, and Native Americans, many of whom were forcefully pushed out of Mexico by the U.S. Army. And American policy has swapped back and forth between a completely open border in Mexico, just like with Canada, and a completely closed border, just over the last century. So the Southwest culture is heavily influenced by Mexican culture. So if America got taken over by Mexicans, it's going to be taken over by a white and Native American hybrid culture. You know, a mix of white people and the people who used to live here before we invaded. Muslim immigrants make up 1.2% of the population, And while they're increasing in the US faster than most other populations, they will still not swamp out white culture. The next generation is going to be much more likely to absorb Western culture. The rate of return of migrants back from the US is between a third to a half, as many who came here wanted the experience or education of living in the US, and they take some Western cultural ideas and skills home with them, which is great for soft power and spreading Western culture. Europe, on the other hand, is being flooded by Muslim and South African migrants and refugees. In 2015, they took 1.3 million refugees, 300,000 of which were offered asylum, roughly 0.2% of the population of the EU. This is a record number, though most of them have ended up in Northern Europe, as many Eastern European nations are refusing to accept them. Mind you, these are refugees, not immigrants. Illegal immigrants make up 1.8 million this year, roughly 0.3% of the population. 2015 and this year are massive aberration years, and most of these people, refugees especially, would prefer to return home if it became safe again, and they will jump at the chance if an upturn in the Afghani, Iraqi, and African economies occur, as well as an increase in safety in Syria. Either way, the chances in their sheer numbers of changing Western culture is microscopic, while the goodwill they get from Western culture will have a huge impact on their mimetic collections. In 2014, 2050 was estimated to have France having 15% of the population being Muslim, the highest percentage in Europe projected at that point. However, just because they're coming from a Muslim nation doesn't mean you're going to stay Muslim. European Muslims are seeing a wave of atheism in Europe among their younger generations, as thanks to ISIS as well as secular ideals of Europe, Islam is getting a real black eye, similar to the impact the child molestation scandal has done to the Catholic Church in Ireland and other countries. Tibet, on the other hand, has 85% of their businesses owned by non-Tibetans, usually Han Chinese, and it is estimated that 60 to 70% of Lhasa is now Han Chinese. That is why it is referred to as a cultural genocide. With Latinos becoming the majority in 2050, one could say that a white culture is under threat, but as I said before, Latinos are a white Native American mix. It will just be a blend of white culture that still exists, and next-generation Latinos tend to absorb American culture when they live here, to the point that the only way to identify them is by their darker skin, and in no way by their mannerisms. American culture is a mix of English, German, Italian, Native American, Irish, African, Muslim, Mexican, and the list keeps growing. The bad parts of the culture weakened and dropped out, but the best parts are kept. Cultures change every generation. It's the only way we can get better. The threat about taco trucks on every corner used to scare the hell out of white people. Now we all love tacos. Mixing up cultures is great because it allows us to select cultural traits that are beneficial and eliminate traits that are harmful. This is the very basis of Dawkins' view of memetics. A culture dies with each new generation, and a new culture is born with the next generation, and hopefully becomes something better. Slavery was once a defining part of white culture, and it died generations ago. Systematic racism was also, and it is being dismantled. The next generation of white culture is hopefully going to be so much more empathic, as well as caring about the environment, and open to new experiences and fact-based ideas. Culture is a constantly changing thing, from generation to generation, and even within a generation. If it wasn't, I would seriously want white culture to die based on our legacy we have in the world. But it is, so white culture will evolve while sharing memes with other cultures, making them better as well. Other cultures are embracing huge aspects of Western, or what is referred to as white culture, and teens in many nations have more in common thanks to shared technology with each other than they do with their parents. It is a phenomena that Michio Kaku referred to as an international culture that is emerging for the first time in history, and is culminating and solidifying to replace the nationalistic ideologies that scares nationalists so much. But as internet and tech advances, keeping isolated as a people culturally is absolutely impossible. Once language translators reach their peak in the next decade, even more so. Our cultures are also now defined more by the internet bubbles we're stuck in than the region we live in, making the culture war even more strained and derisive in our own country. If you're truly worried about the death of American or Western culture, the people you should fear most is China, as they're buying up our theaters and movie studios as well as businesses and have a huge interest in shaping this new global culture using censorship and propaganda in our own media just like they did in Tibet, but without the forceful invasion. Russia is also owning the internet culture, and both are downplaying, denigrating, and creating doubt around democracy and freedom, which is one of the central things defining Western culture in place of autocracy and oligarchy. We can lead the way in the world in spreading our ideas culturally, or we can become isolated and let China shape the international culture. With this election, it looks like a lot of us are fine with the latter if we can live in our own bubble, for now.